What if I told you that in 1943, while Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin met in Tehran to plan the Allied victory, approximately 1,000 Polish Jewish orphans, survivors of Soviet labor camps in Kazakhstan and Siberia, arrived in the same city after walking and riding trains for thousands of miles, only to be denied entry to Palestine by the British and sent on another journey that would take them across the Middle East? These children, aged 4 to 18, most without parents, all having survived years of exile in the Soviet Union, had been released from Soviet labor camps as part of a general amnesty for Polish citizens. They'd traveled south through Central Asia to Iran with Polish refugee groups, hoping to eventually reach safety. But safety was complicated. Britain controlled Palestine and severely restricted Jewish immigration under the White Paper of 1939. The children arrived in Tehran just as the Big Three conference was deciding the post-war world. The leaders who were dividing continents and deciding the fate of millions didn't notice 1,000 Jewish orphans whose future depended on those same decisions. The children eventually reached Palestine in early 1943, not through official channels, but through a rescue operation organized by the Jewish Agency for Palestine, which persuaded Britain to grant a one-time exception. They became known as the Tehran Children, a group whose survival story encapsulates the broader tragedy of Polish Jewry, Soviet brutality, and the desperate refugee crisis that Britain's immigration restrictions created. This is their story. To understand the Tehran Children, you need to understand what happened to Polish Jews after the Soviet invasion of Poland in September 1939. The Soviet occupation of eastern Poland. When Germany and the Soviet Union divided Poland in September 1939, approximately 1.2 to 1.5 million Polish Jews found themselves in Soviet-occupied territory. They faced a choice: remain under Soviet rule or attempt to flee to German-occupied Poland. Most chose to stay. Soviet occupation seemed preferable to Nazi occupation, especially for Jews who knew that Nazi racial policy targeted them specifically. This decision saved many lives in 1939 to 40, but created new dangers. The deportations. The Soviet NKVD, secret police, conducted mass deportations from occupied Poland, targeting unreliable elements for exile to Kazakhstan, Siberia, and other remote regions of the Soviet Union. The deportation waves occurred in 4 major operations between February 1940 and June 1941. Those targeted included Polish army officers and officials, bourgeois elements, business owners, professionals, landowners, political activists and intellectuals, refugees who had fled from German-occupied Poland, viewed as suspicious by Soviet authorities. Zionist activists, considered politically dangerous. Approximately 320,000 Polish citizens were deported in these operations. Of these, an estimated 20 to 30% were Jews. The deportations were brutal. Families roused in the middle of the night, given minutes to pack, transported in cattle cars for weeks to labor camps in Kazakhstan and Siberia. Thousands died during transport from cold, disease, and starvation. Life in exile. Those who survived transport faced forced labor in logging camps, mines, collective farms, and construction projects across the Soviet interior. Conditions were harsh: minimal food rations, often below subsistence level. No adequate winter clothing in regions where temperatures reached minus 40 degrees Celsius. Brutal work quotas with punishment for failure. Minimal medical care. Families separated and dispersed across different camps. Children forced to work alongside adults. Many deportees died from cold, starvation, disease, and overwork. Exact death rates are uncertain, but estimates suggest 20 to 30% of deportees died in exile. The German invasion, June 22, 1941. Germany invaded the Soviet Union. This transformed the strategic situation. Suddenly, Poland and the Soviet Union were no longer enemies but nominal allies, through Britain, which was allied with both the Polish government in exile and the Soviet Union. Under pressure from Britain, Stalin agreed to release Polish citizens from labor camps and allow them to form a Polish army on Soviet territory. The Sikorsky-Mayski Agreement, July 1941, granted amnesty to Polish citizens in Soviet custody. They were released from camps and allowed to travel south to Central Asia, where a Polish army was being organized under General Władysław Anders. The amnesty triggered a massive exodus of Polish refugees from labor camps across the Soviet Union toward the Polish army assembly areas in Central Asia. The journey south, approximately 115,000 Polish refugees, including released prisoners, their families, and Polish Jews who had been in Soviet territory, traveled south to Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, and Turkmenistan, where the Polish army was forming. The journey was chaotic and deadly. No organized transport. Refugees traveled by whatever means available. Trains were overcrowded with people clinging to roofs and sides. Food was scarce. The Soviet Union was experiencing famine. Disease spread rapidly like typhus, dysentery, malaria. Many refugees were already weakened from years of forced labor. Thousands died during the journey south. Families became separated. Children lost parents. The refugee columns stretched across thousands of miles of Soviet territory. The children among the refugees were thousands of children. Orphans whose parents had died in camps or during transport. Children separated from parents during the chaos of release and travel. Teenagers traveling alone or in small groups. Siblings trying to stay together. Jewish refugee organizations and the Polish government and exiles delegation in the Soviet Union attempted to gather and care for orphaned children. They established temporary orphanages in Central Asian cities, but resources were minimal, and children continued arriving in desperate condition. The Anders Army evacuation. In 1942, Soviet authorities agreed to allow the Polish army and associated civilians to evacuate from the Soviet Union to Iran, which was under Allied occupation. This was partly humanitarian and partly Soviet desire to reduce the burden of supporting Polish refugees during wartime. General Anders led approximately 78,000 Polish military personnel and 37,000 Polish civilians, including thousands of children, out of the Soviet Union through Iran between March and August 1942. Among these evacuees were the children who would become known as the Tehran children. The evacuation route took Polish refugees from Central Asia across the Caspian Sea to Iran, then south to Tehran and other Iranian cities. The conditions. The children who traveled this route were in catastrophic condition. Severely malnourished from years of inadequate food, many suffering from diseases, typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis, malaria, inadequately clothed, many wearing rags, lacking shoes, psychologically traumatized from years of separation from parents, camp life, and witnessing death, ranging in age from toddlers to teenagers, with older children often caring for younger ones. One survivor, Yehuda Levi, described the journey. "We were walking skeletons. I was 12 years old and weighed maybe 30 kilograms, 66 pounds. Many children were too weak to walk. The older children carried the younger ones." In Iran, Polish refugees arrived in Iran between March and August 1942. The British and Iranian authorities established refugee camps near Tehran and other cities. The Jewish children among the Polish refugees, approximately 1,000, were gradually identified and gathered into separate groups by representatives of the Jewish Agency for Palestine, which had sent delegates to Iran specifically to assist Jewish refugees. The Jewish Agency's goal was to bring these children to Palestine, where Jewish institutions could care for them, and where they could eventually join their relatives, if any had survived. But there was a problem. Britain controlled Palestine and had severely restricted Jewish immigration under the 1939 White Paper, which limited Jewish immigration to 75,000 over 5 years, a quota that was nearly exhausted by 1942. The negotiations. The Jewish Agency negotiated with British authorities for permission to bring the children to Palestine. The arguments were, these were orphans with no parents or guardians. They were children, not adults who might compete for jobs. Many had relatives in Palestine who could take them in. Humanitarian obligation to save children who had survived Soviet camps. British authorities in London and Jerusalem were divided. Some officials sympathized with the children's plight. Others opposed any exception to immigration restrictions, fearing it would set a precedent and undermine the white paper policy. The debate occurred in late 1942 and early 1943, precisely when Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin were planning the Tehran Conference, November to December 1943, to coordinate Allied strategy, November 28th to December 1st, 1943. The Big Three, Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin, met in Tehran to coordinate Allied strategy. The proximity. While Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin met in Tehran's Soviet embassy compound to discuss the invasion of France, the post-war division of Europe, and the treatment of Germany, approximately 1,000 Jewish orphans were living in refugee camps less than 100 miles away. The leaders discussed grand strategy. The children waited for permission to leave. The leaders decided which countries would be in the Soviet sphere of influence after the war. The children, many from families that had been destroyed by Soviet deportations, didn't know if they'd be allowed to go to Palestine or would be sent back to Poland, which would be in the Soviet sphere. The irony was total. The three leaders deciding the fate of millions didn't consider the 1,000 orphans whose immediate future depended on decisions about immigration policy that Britain controlled, but that intersected with larger questions about the post-war world and the Jewish refugee crisis. The decision in early 1943, before the Tehran Conference, but during the period when planning was underway, British authorities agreed to allow the children to enter Palestine as an exceptional humanitarian case. The decision was made reluctantly and with strict conditions. This was a one-time exception, not a precedent. Only children under 18 with no parents would be admitted. The number would be deducted from the remaining white paper quota. No adult refugees would be included. The decision reflected the impossible position British policy had created, maintaining immigration restrictions while confronting humanitarian crises that those restrictions made worse. February 18, 1943. The first group of Tehran children arrived at Atlit Port in Palestine. The journey. The children traveled from Tehran to Palestine in multiple stages. By truck convoy through Iran to the Iraqi border, by train through Iraq to the Palestine border, by truck to Atlit reception camp near Haifa. The journey took weeks. The children were still malnourished and sick. Medical personnel accompanying them did what they could, but resources were limited. Some children died during the journey, having survived Soviet camps in the trek through Central Asia, only to die within miles of safety. The reception. When the children arrived at Atlit, they were received by Jewish agency personnel, medical staff, and representatives of kibbutzim and children's villages that would eventually house them. The sight of the children shocked even experienced aid workers. One worker described them as looking like old people in children's bodies, ancient eyes and young faces. Medical examinations revealed severe malnutrition in nearly all children, high rates of tuberculosis, parasitic infections, and other diseases, dental problems from years of inadequate nutrition, stunted growth from malnutrition during developmental years, psychological trauma that would take decades to process the distribution. The children were distributed to various institutions across Palestine. Kibbutzim that specialized in youth education, children's villages established by Youth Aliyah, the organization that had been bringing Jewish children from Europe to Palestine since the 1930s, homes of relatives who had already been in Palestine and now took in orphaned family members, religious institutions for children from religious families. The integration was challenging. The children spoke Polish, Russian, or Yiddish, but little Hebrew. They were traumatized and had behavioral problems. Many had forgotten or never learned basic social skills. Some had health problems that required years of treatment. But they had survived. They were safe. And unlike the 3 million Polish Jews who would be murdered in the Holocaust, they had a future. The Tehran children grew up in Palestine and later Israel, carrying their experiences throughout their lives. The integration into Palestinian Jewish society was difficult. The children arrived in 1943 when the Holocaust was still ongoing, but before its full scale was known. They represented a refugee crisis that Palestine's institutions were unprepared to handle. Many children struggled. Flashbacks to camp life and the journey, difficulty trusting adults after losing parents, behavioral problems from trauma, physical health issues that persisted for years, difficulty forming attachments after multiple separations. But the institutions that received them, kibbutzim, children's villages, foster families, provided structure, education, and the beginning of healing. The War of Independence. When Israel declared independence in 1948, many of the Tehran children, now teenagers and young adults, fought in the War of Independence. They had survived Soviet camps and the trek across Asia. They were prepared to fight for the state they'd reached as refugees. The experience of fighting for Israel's survival created a strong sense of belonging. They were no longer refugees. They were citizens defending their home. The testimony. In later decades, many Tehran children gave testimony about their experiences. Their accounts documented the deportations from Poland to Soviet camps, conditions in the camps, the journey through Central Asia to Iran, the negotiations for entry to Palestine, the integration into Israeli society. Their testimonies are archived at Yad Vashem and other institutions, providing crucial documentation of the Soviet deportations and the broader Polish-Jewish refugee experience. The legacy. The Tehran children became part of Israel's founding generation. They worked in kibbutzim, served in the military, raised families, and contributed to building the state. Their children and grandchildren are Israeli citizens, often unaware of the full story of how their parents or grandparents arrived. Some became prominent. Yehuda Levi became a businessman and philanthropist. Yitzhak Levy served in the Israeli Knesset. Others became educators, farmers, soldiers, artists. They were among the last large groups of European Jewish refugees to reach Palestine before the Holocaust consumed the rest. The Tehran children's story reveals important aspects of the refugee crisis of World War II and the politics of immigration. The British policy failure. Britain's White Paper of 1939 restricted Jewish immigration to Palestine at exactly the moment when European Jews most desperately needed refuge. The policy was designed to appease Arab opposition to Jewish immigration and prevent conflict in Palestine during wartime. But the policy created impossible situations. Jewish refugees fleeing death had nowhere to go because the one territory that would accept them was restricted. The Tehran children were admitted only as an exceptional case after prolonged negotiations. This wasn't theoretical, it was life and death. The 1,000 children who reached Palestine survived. The 3 million Polish Jews who couldn't escape were murdered. The Soviet dimension. The Tehran children's survival depended on a chain of unlikely events. The Soviet-German alliance that occupied eastern Poland. The deportations that paradoxically saved them from the Holocaust. The German invasion of the Soviet Union that ended their exile. The Anders Army evacuation that took them to Iran. The Jewish Agency's rescue operation. Britain's exceptional permission. Each link was necessary. Break anyone and the children die in camps, in Poland during the Holocaust, or in Iran without means to continue. The invisibility of child refugees. The Tehran children's story was largely unknown for decades. They were absorbed into Israeli society. Their specific experience of Soviet camps, the trek through Asia, the Tehran Passage, wasn't widely documented until survivors began testifying in the 1980s to 90s. This reflects a broader pattern. Child refugees are often invisible in historical records. They don't control policy, don't command armies, don't make decisions that historians record. Their experience is documented only when, as adults, they choose to testify. Today, there's a memorial in Israel to the Tehran children, a small monument in the Givat Haim settlement that houses some of the survivors' testimony and photographs from their arrival in 1943. The photographs show skeletal children, hollow eyes wearing mismatched clothes too large or too small, standing in lines at Atlit reception camp. They look like concentration camp survivors, which in a sense they were. The Soviet forced labor camps weren't extermination camps, but they killed through deprivation, cold, and disease. The Tehran children survived because of timing, luck, and a series of decisions that could have gone differently at any point. If the Soviet Union hadn't invaded Poland, they'd have been in German territory and likely murdered in the Holocaust. If Stalin hadn't released them from camps, they'd have died in Siberia. If the Anders army hadn't evacuated to Iran, they'd have remained in the Soviet Union. If the Jewish Agency hadn't negotiated for them, they'd have remained in Iran. If Britain hadn't granted the exception, they wouldn't have reached Palestine, 1,000 children. Each one surviving because of decisions made by people who never met them, who were solving other problems, who couldn't have known the consequences of their choices. Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin met in Tehran in November 1943 to decide the shape of the post-war world. They discussed Poland's future borders, Germany's occupation zones, the United Nations structure. They decided which countries would be free and which would be in the Soviet sphere. While they met, 1,000 Polish Jewish orphans were camped nearby, waiting for permission to continue to Palestine. The Big Three didn't discuss them. These children weren't on the agenda. But those children's lives depended on the world the Big Three were creating. Would Poland be independent or Soviet-controlled? Would Jewish refugees have a state that would accept them? Would Britain maintain its immigration restrictions? The answers to those questions determined whether the Tehran children would be the last Jewish refugees to escape, or simply another group who had survived one catastrophe only to face another. They survived. They reached Palestine. They built lives in Israel. And their grandchildren are Israelis who may not know that their grandparents walked from Siberia through Kazakhstan and Iran, arriving in Tehran while three men met 100 miles away to decide the world's future. If you want to understand refugee crises, the politics of immigration during wartime, and how policy decisions determine life and death, subscribe, because the Tehran children weren't saved by grand strategy or political decisions. They were saved by their own survival instincts, by the Jewish organizations that fought for them, and by a series of fortunate accidents that allowed 1,000 orphans to slip through the cracks of history and reach safety. While the Big Three decided the fate of millions, 1,000 children decided their own fate. They walked, and they survived.